This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky, and we are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Hikaru Nakamura at the 2010 FIDE World Blitz Championship. You can see the crowd gathered around them, and a handshake goes on, and the arbiter starts the clock. Magnus of the white pieces as he plays e4. Hikaru, known for his incredibly versatile opening repertoire as he plays a French. Magnus responds with knight c3, the main line, and the Steinitz variation by Hikaru, knight f6. Magnus closes up the center with e5, supports it with f4, and they're following a very well-known theoretical continuation, blitzing out the moves, and now the queen likely to appear on b6, but Hikaru chooses a sideline with a6, b5, expanding on the queen side. This is still very well known. You can see the nonchalance with which they're making the moves, but now the first surprise of the game is Hikaru strikes at the king side, g5, trying to break up Magnus's central pawn chain, and he succeeds in doing so. Magnus recaptured with the pawn, which is a little bit surprising. Now Hikaru takes that very valuable pawn on e5, and he's got a pretty big center here in the early going. You can see Hikaru with pawns on e6 and d5, and Magnus really has no answer for that. And that knight on e5 is a lot of prospects. It can move to g4, it can move to c4, and Magnus, that gave him a little bit of pause as he spends 10 seconds or so on bishop d3, continuing his development. Now, a big question is going to be which way are the sides going to castle? Well, there's the answer from Magnus as he castles kingside, but Hikaru's king is also probably going to castle kingside. Even though Hikaru's kingside pawn structure is a little bit damaged, he misses a g-pawn. But look at that dark-squared bishop on g7. It's going to provide the black king a lot of shelter if and when Hikaru chooses to castle kingside. But right now, Hikaru is thinking he's not castling yet. Maybe he's contemplating knight g4. If he can get rid of Magnus's dark-squared bishop, then that knight on d4 is going to lose a key supporter, a key team player, and Hikaru with the longest think of the game so far. And there he goes with knight g4. Attacking that bishop on e3. And the problem for Magnus is that if he moves that bishop up to f4, it's going to become susceptible to a fork. Hikaru could advance that e-pawn up to e5. He could also play queen d8 to b6, a move that I thought he would play a lot earlier, but that move could come at the least pleasant moment. With that being said, I still think Magnus should try to keep his dark-squared bishop alive at all costs as he takes quite a while on this move, leans back in his chair. A little bit of exasperation, frustration there for Magnus. Unclear where he went wrong, but he doesn't like what he sees as Hikaru has developed tremendous piece activity. And for a French, he's gotten a fantastic position. And Magnus responds with a very calm move, king h1, and he agrees to part ways with his dark-squared bishop. Now, I would take that bishop at the first available opportunity right now, because if Hikaru delays, then Magnus is going to drag his bishop back to g1, and Hikaru wastes no time as he trades the dark-squared bishop. I like Hikaru's position here as he moves his queen up to e7, covering the x-ray that white's queen was exerting on black's king, and stopping shenanigans related to the knight on d4 moving to f5. Now Hikaru's king is safe for the time being, even though it's in the center. Magnus moves his other knight up to g3. Hikaru casting a glance up at his opponent before moving his bishop up to e5, centralizing it. Look at that knight on d7, supporting its compatriot on e5. Magnus under pressure. He's a little bit lower, not even a little bit. He's 40 seconds down on the clock as he continues to think. And Hikaru looking pretty confident, his position looking good. What's interesting is that Hikaru still hasn't castled. Maybe he's flirting with the concept of castling queenside. That's totally not out of the question. Now that Magnus lacks a dark-squared bishop, which would have been a very effective piece with which to attack black's king on the queenside. So Hikaru, I can guarantee you that he's thinking about which way he should castle, or maybe he won't castle at all. Maybe Hikaru will decide that his king is safer in the center than on either of the flanks. This is a big decision. Hikaru with the two bishops, a big center, but with a slightly exposed king, and Hikaru's light-squared bishop, well, if that long diagonal opens, it's going to be a beast, but for the time being, it's still pretty passive. The clock beginning to equalize. Hikaru has taken 30 seconds. This is a critical moment. He senses it. What will he do? He's about to make a move, and that move is rook g8. Hikaru forfeits his opportunity to castle kingside because when you move a rook, you can't castle to that same side, but instead, he decides to target that pawn on g5. He decides that controlling the g-file is even more important than castling. And so, unless he castles queenside, it's very likely that Hikaru will keep his king in the center for the foreseeable future. Maybe for the rest of the game, we will see. You can see the spectators, they are captivated by what's going on the board, and Magnus with another long think as his clock approaches a minute. A very concerning position here. I don't know if white can afford to lose the g-pawn, because if he loses it, then Hikaru's pieces will acquire a newfound activity. That bishop on e5 and that rook, which will appear on g5, are going to exert tremendous pressure on the knight on g3. But if Magnus plays h4, then he weakens his own knight on g3, and Hikaru could respond by pushing his own h-pawn up to h6. And Magnus, he continues to think. He's now down to 50 seconds. It's so dangerous to get this low on the clock with Hikaru Nakamura. He knows how to put pressure in his opponent's time pressure, and He's just better on the board. Magnus in trouble here as his clock ticks down to 40 seconds. And the spectators kind of uneasy in their seats, waiting for the world champion to make a move. He's down to 30 seconds. He still doesn't know what to do. Will he play h4? Will he give up g5? He looks at the clock. He sees the urgency, and he finally plays h4. But what answer will he have to h6? What if Hikaru tries to get rid of that g-pawn at all costs? Look at that knight on g3. It's only protected by a queen, and it is hungrily eyed by that bishop on e5 and that rook on g8. And Hikaru is up a full minute on the clock. He's got plenty of time to think here. h6 looks really good, and Hikaru plays it without delay. Magnus sacrificing the knight in the center. But is that a desperation sacrifice? I think it is. What if Hikaru just moves his queen up to e6? What is Magnus's follow-up going to be? That bishop on e5, it's a key defender, and Hikaru, no, he just plays queen c5. Look at that knight on d7. Magnus shakes his head. That knight is defending both the queen and the bishop. Magnus is down a piece. What does he have to show for it? He's got 20 seconds on the clock. His clock is ticking down. He's looking at the clock. The spectators are looking at the clock. He doesn't know what to do. He's down a piece. Hikaru is on the road to winning this game, and Magnus sees nothing better than to trade queens, and he grabs the second pawn on h6. It's not over yet. We know of Magnus's resilience. He's got 2 pawns for the piece. The rook is attacked. f7 is attacked. Hikaru very likely to move his rook up to g7. He hesitates briefly. He still has over a minute on the clock. He plays rook h8. Now, Magnus can't take on f7 with the rook because if rook takes h6, and his bishop was hanging too, and that gives Hikaru a chance to save his f-pawn. And Magnus desperately trying to centralize his remaining reserves, bringing all the toys to the nursery party. It's not over yet. Hikaru realizes that he still has to play accurately. Perhaps knight e4, clogging up the e-file even further. Another glance at the clock from Magnus. He senses the desperation. And Hikaru, it seems that with only a couple more accurate moves, he should be able to consolidate his extra piece, and he sacrifices it in exchange on e6. And now he brings the knight up to e4. Magnus moves his king away. There was a fork threatened, and Hikaru hesitating a little bit. He's probably going to bring his own king up to the center. Now Hikaru has 2 minor pieces for a rook. But look at the activity of those minor pieces. A knight in the center, a bishop on e5. And those h-pawns are sitting ducks, as Hikaru illustrates with his last move, rook h8, attacking h6. But now knight g3. Knight g3 is going to trap the rook and force Magnus to re-sacrifice an exchange. And Hikaru doesn't even have to hurry with that move. Look at that rook on h5. It's totally trapped, but Hikaru down to 40 seconds. He's getting a little bit nervous. And Magnus has done a great job of defending thus far, but can he survive with 10 seconds on the clock in a still a worse position? Hikaru drags his king over to f7. He was threatening king g6. Magnus defends his rook, supports it by pushing his g-pawn up. But the prospect of knight g3 still really scares me. That would trap the rook, and Magnus is probably planning to give that rook up for the bishop on e5. Hikaru, he brings his bishop out of dodge, and now knight g3 is even a more terrifying threat. It's 5 seconds for Magnus as he plays bishop b3, attacking d5. Hikaru has to defend it. He plays knight d2. There's a fork on f3. And Magnus's bishop is attacked. 3 seconds on the clock. He brings it back to d1. He manages to press the clock in time, but now his pieces are at an all-time low in terms of their passivity, and Hikaru can take on h6. He can bring his king up to g6, but he's down to 15 seconds, and he does take on h6. And we have a rook trade. And Magnus is still not out of the game, but he's about to flag, and he flags! He flags, and he points to his own clock, and he was already worse. But what a game this was, and if you enjoyed this game, please click on the links in the playlist. Thank you so much for watching.